Hello, everyone. This is Rob Orson with Emerging Revolutionary War on our Revelry podcast as we continue in the season of the 250th, talking about different topics that relate to the American Revolution and its 250th anniversary, which is right now upon us. There's a lot of attention going on with Boston, Lexington, and Concord, but being a native Virginian, we cannot leave out the events that are taking place in the spring of 1775 in Virginia. And I'm very happy to have three of my good friends with me here who are a wealth of knowledge. It's amazing just walking anywhere with Michael and Maureen here who are joining us. Walk Yorktown with both of them, walk Williamsburg. You guys share so much great information, and I'm glad we actually have you on a podcast here. So hopefully you guys can share it with everyone listening. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we're honored.
And we have Mark, who's an ERW regular, obviously. So Mark needs no introduction. Mark's here for entertainment value, as always. So as we talk about Virginia and the spring of 1775, I'm going to throw it to Mark briefly to talk about kind of what's happened in Virginia, especially around Dunmore's War in 74. Don't want to dive too much into this because our focus is the April 21 powder incident in Williamsburg, but kind of give the people listening and watching a little bit of background of what has happened in Virginia in the fall and winter of 75.
Yeah, and yeah, no, I think it's really interesting to look at Virginia right at this time period in April 1775, almost just a couple days from when the actual first shots are fired up at Lexington and Concord. You have this real high drama that kind of plays out in the capital city of Williamsburg. But yeah, no, it's really interesting too. And, anybody who's followed Emerging Revolutionary War over the past few months, you've been kind of following all the major 250th anniversary events. It really kind of puts it in context, but it is kind of crazy to think that just a few months before, in October of 1774, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, is fighting side by side, literally, with the Virginians against the Indians on the frontier in modern day West Virginia and Ohio. And there was that battle against the Indians at Point Pleasant in October 1774. Dunmore wasn't at that battle, but he was nearby with another column of Virginia troops. The Virginians are able to defeat the Indians. They sign a peace treaty, and Dunmore comes back and is really kind of well liked and almost a hero among many Virginians. And it's amazing how quickly that's going to change over the next few months. Of course, once he gets back, you do have at the same time that's all happening. You have the First Continental Congress meeting up in Philadelphia with Virginia delegates, including Patrick Henry, who are up there. And, that's one of the first major times that all these different colonies are really starting to meet and talk together about how they're going to oppose these measures, the intolerable acts that had been levied specifically against Massachusetts. Virginia is looking at everything that's going on up in Massachusetts and thinking that they could be next. If Great Britain can do these things to one colony, what's stopping them from doing it to any of the other royal colonies? And over these months, and this is what I think it's great that it's really interesting when you read the role that Patrick Henry is going to play in all of the Powder Magazine incident in April 1775. It was just a few short weeks ago, we were up and Maureen was there as well, of being in St. John's Church, where the Fifth Virginia Convention was a meeting in Richmond, Virginia, and that's where Patrick Henry gave his famous oratory of "Give me liberty or give me death." And it's just amazing that it's just a few short weeks from that moment the Powder Magazine incident's going to happen, and everything's going to really kind of change throughout the whole country once people learn what happened up at Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, there's a lot of things moving fast, right? It's interesting how things are moving in New England and in the southern colonies all at the same time. They are talking with each other, but we'll see as we go along here. A lot of these things are happening almost instantaneously at the same time. So Mark talked about Dunmore and Dunmore's war. Michael and Maureen, can you all talk a little about who Lord Dunmore was? And I know the people of Williamsburg loved his wife, and there was a great relationship there between her and the people in town, and just Virginians in general had an affection for her, and actually for him too, before everything kind of falls apart. Can you all talk a little bit about who he was, where he's from, and the feelings that the Virginians are having towards him in the late winter, early spring of 75?
Talk about Lord Dunmore, and Maureen, do you want to talk about Lady Dunmore?
Sure.
Okay. Lord Dunmore is a Scottish peer. He was born in 1730. He was a Jacobite. We know that did not work out well with Bonnie Prince Charlie in the 1745 Highland Rebellion, and only because his uncle, the second Earl of Dunmore, was very popular with the Hanoverians, was Lord Dunmore's father, who became the third Earl. They were spared because we can say that obviously the British reaction to the 1745 Highland Rebellion was pretty swift and had some pretty big repercussions, but he moved among the movers and shakers of British society. He was a member of the House of Lords. And Lord Dunmore, though, always had that hanging over his head that he had supported the Jacobites. So I believe that also comes into play later on when you have some problems in the colony, because he is not going to be the one that loses the Old Dominion to the rabble. I mean, this is the oldest and most prosperous and wealthy colony of the 13 colonies. So to be put into it is a big deal. He had first been the royal governor of New York, which I think he preferred weather-wise, as well as he was investing lands in western New York and what's now Vermont. And then because, like many men, he was smart enough to marry well. So I'm going to let Maureen carry on the torch with Lady Dunmore.
Yeah. So Lady Dunmore married Lord Dunmore. She was about 18 in 1759. He was 30. She was born a lady. Her father was Earl Stuart. She was born Charlotte Stuart, and she had a lot of siblings, and one of her siblings' husbands was the president of the Privy Council. So they had the earldom, I guess you call it. Correct me, Michael. In England, so they had nice land, but they didn't have a lot of money. And a lot of those people back then wanted to spend a lot of money. So she was kind of the mover and shaker. And she asked her sister if she could, get her husband a job. And her husband, the Earl Gower, I believe his name was, got him a job as governor of New York. And everything was good. He loved New York. Lord Dunmore came over in 1770 and started buying land and making good with the people up in the colony of New York. And then Lord Broadetot died here in Virginia, and you got paid more money in Virginia. So his wife, Charlotte, asked her brother-in-law if he could get a job as governor of Virginia. And he was successful in that. And they told Lord Dunmore that he was coming to Virginia, and he wasn't happy about it because he made all these friends up in New York and bought all this land, and which I think is today Vermont. And so he didn't want to come down here, but he ended up having to come down here in 1771.
What's interesting about Lord Dunmore is he's the royal governor. He's not the lieutenant governor, because many of the governors that came to Virginia were not the royal governor. They were lieutenant governor, because they're not going to leave London or their estates and come over here. But he's an actual peer of the realm. He is the royal governor, and he comes over. Let's see, Norborne Barclay, the fourth Baron Bodytot, was the governor before him, even though William Nelson, the father of Governor Thomas Nelson Jr. from the Revolutionary War, was the acting royal governor for a short amount of time. But the idea of class and the idea of, I mean, the Secretary Nelson and William Nelson bought Lord Bodytot's carriage. So it'd be like you and Mark going through Prince William County in some tricked out, Bentley or something like that. Everybody knew that these people have a lot of money because they're riding around the former royal governor's uh, coach. And when Dunmore arrives, that makes a big deal because he's here. And then of course Maureen can talk about the family arriving later on. But when he first gets here, he has some challenges, of course, because things are starting to. If he had been here 10 or 15 years earlier, he would have been golden. He would have been probably remembered as one of the better royal governors, but he showed up in a time period in our history when things were starting to go downhill after the Stamp Act and all the other things that are leading up to the revolution.
Yeah, and we've already talked about in previous podcasts about the dissolution of the House of Burgesses there in Williamsburg and Dunmore's role in that and the reaction to that. And actually, the four of us were actually down there. We were one of the few
Yeah.
people down there talking about it on the actual date, right? That's
You
what
were
we
there
did
at the time, at the
at the
place. Yeah,
time, at the place. Not that we were weird or anything, but
We're
but
passionate. There's a difference.
that's right, passion. Um, but it's interesting if someone can talk a little bit briefly about the relationship. So you had the dissolution of the General Assembly, right? I mean, the House of Burgesses. You had Lord Dunmore's War, which most of the colonists were very supportive of the governor doing that. But then you start having the convention, and you start seeing these independent companies form in these counties across the colony, and these independent companies really don't have any legal status as far as the governor goes. So he's watching these things happen, and of course the news comes from Boston about the powder alarm and outside of Cambridge and other things going on up there. How is the governor kind of navigating all these different pressures without igniting a powder keg, so to speak?
The governor, you've got to realize that a lot of these folks were military officers and had military training, where in this instance, somebody that would have been from what they later called the diplomatic corps would have been very appropriate to have
Hmm.
had somebody where they could have cut them a deal or something to have kept Virginia loyal to the crown and decided to separate them from the rest of the colonies. Lord Dunmore looked at, I mean, when he dissolved the House of Burgesses, the Militia Act was up to be renegotiated. So they had to go back to the one from 1738. And you can only imagine what he was thinking when the Hanover, Culpeper, Spotsylvania, and other areas were starting to raise these independent companies. They even had one in Williamsburg. And because of the powder alarm, most of the British regulars, if they had had many in Virginia, were up in Massachusetts trying to reinforce General Gage. So he's looking at this with a certain sense of apprehension. And Maureen found a letter that he wrote to the colonial secretary, the Earl of Dartmouth. And Maureen, do you want to tell him a little bit more about that, or do you want me to cover that?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so she found the letter, and it basically he's spazzing out. That's my way of looking at it as an 80s teenager, that he has got all these, he's saying like 2,000 armed people running around the colony who are not legally allowed to muster, and he's fearing for his own life. He's fearing for his property, his wife, his family, and he writes to the Earl of Dartmouth, the colonial secretary. He's like, this is concerning, and you need to be concerned that we're on the precipice of a revolution, or at least there's maybe not a revolution politically in his mind, but civil unrest. And it brings out the worst in him. The Earl of Dunmore, they said, Maureen found a quote that said he had a capable but not a formidable intellect. So he wasn't an idiot, but he wasn't maybe the most diplomatic person. We all have met people like that their own worst enemy. And he was someone who could fly off the handle. And this really required a statesman's like touch, where it's unfortunate that people like Peyton Randolph and the Americans come off, or the Virginians come off, as a little more cooler headed and better able to work things through and try to placate both Colonel Patrick Henry later and also the governor you see them as peacemakers, where Dunmore could have led the charge and tried to maybe dial back the situation. But I could understand if he felt like he was at siege in his own in the governor's palace, that's going to lead him to do some things and make some rather rash statements.
So I want to talk about his family because it's a big part of some of the decisions he'll make before and after the incident. What is the British presence? Now I know they're all British, but the military presence in Virginia at that time. So you have the governor. What kind of military forces does he have at his disposal? I mean, we know there's a large army in Boston, but there's not really a large military force here in Virginia at his disposal, correct?
No, that's the problem. He is the king's man. He has to enforce the House of Commons, the House of Lords, Parliament's decrees, any of the king's Privy Council, and as I said, any of the regulars that they had in Virginia went up with a powder alarm to Massachusetts. So there's some warships that are in one or two. There's the HMS Magdalen in the James River. There's the HMS Foley in the York River. They have Royal Marines and sailors that can be armed, but we're not talking like 1,000 regulars or something that he has at his disposal. He doesn't. And Maureen could talk more about the family, but it was a double-edged sword. What made them wildly popular in 1774 by having, Viscount Fincastle, his heir, and his other children there, and enrolling him at the College of William and Mary, was a liability by 1775 having his family there.
Right, right. So Maureen, talk a little bit about his family. Like Michael said, it's a big part of the endearment that people have for him. As he said, enrolling him in the College of William and Mary kind of he's trying to integrate his family into the Virginia society. But as Michael pointed out, that actually becomes a liability later on. Talk a little bit about his family, his kids, and I know he has some really cool names for his kids. If you can talk about some of his children.
Okay. So she comes over in 1774, Lady Dunmore, and she brings with her 5 children. One child had just recently died, and one was too young to come along with them. So she had 3 sons and 2 daughters that join her. Lady Dunmore, this would have been like Queen Elizabeth coming to Williamsburg, which she did in 2007. So everybody was excited. They didn't have this level of aristocrats, I guess, coming to that part. This is kind of backwards, from England. So she would have come with all the newest fashion. She was supposed to be very elegant, very beautiful. People, you can see quotes where she was the fairer one of the two of them, that he married up totally with her, and they wondered why she would marry him. But so they were a very popular family. And as soon as she got here, evidently, in February of 74, March, anyway, their daughter, the first one being born at the palace, who would be Lady Virginia, was born in December. So now they have 6 children at the palace, one being an infant. When Lord Dunmore comes back from the West with, his success with the natives out there, they have a ball for Lady Dunmore's birthday, which was in January, the baptism of Lady Virginia, and also to celebrate his success with the Native Americans, and more lands opened up. So that was January of 1775. Things would change very quickly after
Yeah.
that they had this big party.
Yeah, and it's just amazing how fast things go, right? In telling the story.
Yeah,
Um,
and I was just gonna say, I remember when we were at the Capitol during when they dissolved the House of Burgesses,
There's a
because
ball
they,
too.
they had the ball then too. I mean, it's just interesting that it goes from this very genteel political disagreement where they still maintain these kinds of personal engagements with each other to a few months later where there's fear for life and safety and things like that. It's
right.
just very interesting
Um,
how quickly that changes.
and Mark, I was going to have you talk a little bit about again, and you mentioned St. John's and the Second Virginia Convention. Maureen, Mark, and I were up there for the anniversary. Got to stand outside where Carrington stood and listened to the speech. Things seemed to, as far as the powder incident here in Williamsburg, in Virginia, in April of '75, things seemed to really change in Dunmore's mind after the second convention. I know we focused so much on Patrick Henry's speech, and that's what we remember, and that's what's been documented over time. But it's the motion that Patrick Henry made in that convention that really starts to set things in motion in the mind of Dunmore, working his mind to going and taking the powder. So, Mark, if you can briefly talk about what that motion was that Henry was proposing there in the convention, and what that would mean for Virginians moving forward.
Yeah, no, and that was, we all remember the speech, but the actual effort that they were trying to do was to, begin to prepare for conflict, and begin to, raise these companies of troops, and fund them to actually be able to. Well, they didn't have any funding at the time, but basically give them, like I said, these were all the independent companies that were being raised in 1774. There was no legal precedent for them because, the militia was loyal to the royal governor. So the governor would call out the militia when needed. And so all of a sudden you have these independent companies coming up, and the Virginia Convention is going to try and, are we going to prepare for war? And obviously, up in Massachusetts, in other colonies, they're doing the exact same thing where they're preparing, mustering, training, and getting ready, for what they believe would be, self-defense. And of course, Patrick Henry says, the next gale from the north will bring the resounding clash of arms, and it's all, very prescient what he said, because it was only a few weeks later that would come from the north.
Right. Yeah, that's late March that happens, and that vote is tight, right? The second Virginia Convention doesn't vote overwhelmingly for Henry's resolution to start raising funds and arm Virginia for war. It's pretty close, but the big names that become patriots later on, Washington, Jefferson, they're all voting in the affirmative, but there's still Virginia has not fully gone over to the side of rebellion or open conflict. It's that the motion carries, but doesn't carry by a lot. So kind of
Five
shows you,
votes, I think.
yeah, right, five
Five
votes.
votes.
So it's tight, right? I mean that's a close vote.
Yeah.
So that happens, and then Dunmore starts to get really concerned about the gunpowder. Michael, if you could talk a little bit about the notion of who owned the powder, right? And that's one thing I think a lot of people forget today. There's a debate about the powder belonged to the colony, the powder belonged to the king. And that's a debate that's going to play out here in Williamsburg. Talk a little bit about how these powder magazines worked in the colonial period, and who actually do you think owned the powder?
No, it was public powder. That was the patriots or the colonists felt that way. The powder magazine was constructed in 1715, and it was pretty formidable. It had firearms. It had, at that time period, over 350 new muskets. It had 30-something barrels of powder, and it had any number of other accoutrements that you would need to put down a slave rebellion or any type of thing that the patriots or the colonists were worried about. Then in their mind, it was their property because it was paid for by their money, and their taxes went into that. It was for their defense. Lord Dunmore, being the chief executive and being in charge of the militia, I imagine he thought that was his prerogative, especially if there was extra legal military organizations running around, that he wanted to protect that powder to make sure that it didn't fall in the wrong people's hands. And he's going to come up with a pretty crafty scheme in order to be able to pull all that off.
Well, let's dive into the scheme. Let's get to the main point of the story here, with Dunmore deciding to bring the sailors ashore and come into town. Talk a little bit about the plan and a little bit and what happens? How does this get carried out?
Well, he's going to get the keys to the powder magazine from the gentleman, Mr. Miller, that was in charge of it. And he gets the keys. That is told to Peyton Randolph and other individuals that he now has the keys. And they start putting a watch on the magazine. The colonists are looking around, running around, trying to figure that out. And they finally, April's a weird month. It's rained all day here in Tidewater, Virginia, and it was blustery. It wouldn't have been much different than the day of April 21st, because even though the colonists had watchers around the magazine, Dunmore had his own people out there watching the watchers. So as soon as the weather cleared, he sent his wagon with some folks down to right down Francis Street and by down Quarter Path Road into what's now Kingsmill on the James. It would have been right at Burrell's Ferry, as they would have called it back then. In the HMS Magdalene, they had to wake up a party of Marines and armed sailors. They had the gunner and the gunner's mate from the HMS Magdalene. The captain of the Magdalene came along, and then they marched up again right up by Quarter Path Road, which for the Civil War would have been readouts 1 and 2 for the Confederates, and then kept moving right on into Francis Street through the Backett Way to get into the powder magazine. Well, you don't just start fumbling around with powder. That's why they had the gunner's mate there and the gunner to make sure you're properly handling it. You don't want to have some kind of explosion and suddenly splatter everybody all over town. So they go in and they inspect the gunpowder, and while they're pulling it out, somebody saw them. Either they were up doing some kind of farm labor, they couldn't sleep, or one of the watchers had kind of huddled in a corner somewhere and they gave an alarm. Well, they're able to take off and start moving down toward the James River, and they're not able to catch them, and they're able to put most of the powder on board the ship. And that's when it really, everything goes haywire, because they start beating drums. They call out the independent company. People are under arms. They meet at the courthouse. Speaker of the House of Burgesses, Peyton Randolph's there. Other people are there trying to calm these people down, and they're ready to go march on the governor's palace and demand that he return the powder to them. And that's really when the situation, you can have all the balls and parties and good feelings about things under social order, but when you take people's firearms and the way for them to defend themselves, and you've got some cockamamie story you've come up with, that's not going to go well with people.
So, so it's tense, right? It's a tense situation. And I'm assuming Dunmore's family is there at the palace, correct? He's right. So you have this kind
At
of
the time.
What was that? I'm sorry.
At the time. I mean,
Right.
they will move to the York River temporarily.
Right. So it's very tense. There's a standoff there. As you mentioned, Michael, they're meeting there at the courthouse. Take us through next steps here. So I know a little bit about what happens, but tell us a little bit about like how this interaction goes when they try to approach the governor and try to get some official word of why the powder was taken. And I know that they're asking for the powder to be returned, and eventually they get paid for it, supposedly. But what happens after this mob, for lack of a better word, gets together there in Williamsburg and goes towards the palace? Or do they go toward the palace?
Well, and I got a question for you, Michael, too, is as far as like about how much, what what he would have thought the reaction to this would have been, and like, because obviously Thomas Gage up in Boston did something very similar to this a few months earlier that led to an almost rebellion breaking out up there as well, and. It was Dunmore expecting this kind of reaction to what he was doing.
Most of the royal governors to make sure that they secure their colony powder and weaponry. So this was British governmental policy that he's enforcing. And he I don't think he's the most diplomatic person on the planet. I think first he being an aristocrat, he looked down on these folks, and the fact that they were, as he said, insulting to the king by forming these independent companies, by continuing to have these extra legal legislative assemblies and other things. He's forced, in his mind, he's being forced to take a hard line against them. And by denying them the firearms and powder, I think he was rather surprised, however, why he would have been, that they would have, armed themselves. And I think it really did concern him that they were going to march on the governor's palace and possibly massacre, as he said, he used the word massacre, every inhabitant in the place. And I think that was, I wouldn't say he was paranoid, but I think he was acutely aware of his own survival. And they hardly had any real way of protecting himself. He armed his servants. His secretary was a Navy captain, Captain Foy, and he was armed, and there was kind of the siege mentality. And again, the Virginians' leadership with Peyton Randolph and others were able to calm the crowd down. They went the next day to chat with the governor to find out why he had taken the powder. And Governor Dunmore told him that he had removed it to a place of safety because he feared a slave insurrection and he didn't want them getting a hold of the powder. And I don't know how he was able to tell him that with a straight face, but he did. And they were satisfied. He said, I can bring the powder in an hour from the ship. It's not that far away. We can get it here in an emergency. And they went back and told the people assembled at the courthouse, armed or unarmed, whichever ones were there, that they were satisfied with his answer. And the townspeople kind of dispersed, but that led to that answer did not work for everybody, as we'll see with Colonel Patrick Henry and other folks.
Right.
Do we know if there was any truth to that story at all? Were there any rumor, or was there any threat of an actual slave insurrection, or do
They had
we?
some issues in Chesterfield County and in Norfolk and other places. I mean, they're always in fear of a slave insurrection. And I think he used that somewhat to play upon their own. I mean, if he was afraid, he also used it, and he saw that as their Achilles heel, the enslaved population. And he would later, of course, use that and try to use it to his own advantage. But he was a pretty shrewd person. I mean, the victors write the history, but people always show him as a hothead and all this sort of stuff and other things. But I think he was also a very calculating person as well.
So this happens April 21st, which is just 2 days after Lexington conquered. Obviously, people in Virginia had not learned about what happened in Boston, so just crazy the timing here. So Maureen, you talked about his family, and obviously, as Michael just said, he was concerned about everyone, at some point being under threat there in the palace. When does he decide to get his family out of the house there, and where did they go?
They went to the York River. It was around the first part of May. I think it was the first week of May, maybe the end of April. They first went to Portobello, which was his plantation in York County. It's where Camp Perry is today. You can't go see it unless you're part of the CIA or something. Anyway, and then from there, they took him to the security of the HMS Foey. So they put him on there. They do eventually come back for a short time, I think in the middle of May when things have calmed down and Patrick Henry goes up to Philadelphia. I guess he feels it's safe enough, but he is worried about them. And you got to picture the governor's palace. He made that a fortified little town himself and put cannons out there. They said all the windows were open with guns drawn, and his slaves were given arms against these people. So things were escalating quite a bit. He wasn't the most diplomatic person, I don't think. He kind of allowed those escalations, and there was still a lot of people like Randolph, Peyton Randolph, that was trying to keep things calmed down, as we will see as the story goes on.
Right. And it's amazing that she does come back with her family because
Mhm.
it's on April 28th that the first word reaches Williamsburg about Lexington and Concord. Now blood's been shed, right?
Right.
And then the Second Continental Congress will be meeting. So this is going to again keep escalating. So it's amazing to me that with the tension of the powder and then what they find out about a week later with Lexington and Concord that she even comes back to Williamsburg. It just kind of shows how even there in town, tensions are up and they smooth. It's just kind of a very fluid situation in general. It's not something where, they hear about Lexington and Concord and the whole town rises up and takes arms against the governor. It doesn't happen like that.
Well, it's interesting. The Burgesses have a report saying, "Why were you worried about us? We would have kept you protected. We love you and your children." But you got to understand what Lord Dunmore was going through. I mean, there were 2,000 people all through Virginia ready to pounce on him, that
Right.
they had to use a lot of diplomacy to get that calmed down. And Michael, about 40 people, 40 Marines maybe that he had, I think, because Boston was such a hotbed and always was, and Virginia were like the good children all the time for the king. They didn't protect Lord Dunmore as much as they probably should have. But here we are today. So
Right.
might have been all for the best.
If I was in his shoes, I wouldn't believe him either.
Yeah, right. But they were offended. They were offended that they thought that they would hurt those children and Lady
Fair.
Dunmore. But
Right.
mob can get out of hand pretty quick.
True.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead, Mark.
Well,
You saying something?
I was just gonna say, in all our studies of what happened up at Lexington and Concord, and you have all, when the British go out to go, in a similar fashion. In that case, wasn't just to secure, but to actually destroy munitions and things like that, weapons of war. You have, these units rising up all across New England and converging on the British column, and then of course it breaks out into this long, brutal fighting that lasts all day. As news comes down here to Virginia, at the same time, just like in Massachusetts, there's these militia units that are all rising up. Guys are mustering together. I'm up, close to Fredericksburg, Virginia. In Fredericksburg, they're having a large convention of all these different troops getting together when they learn about what happened up at Lexington and Concord. And there is a real feeling of we need to march on Williamsburg and we need to go, secure our powder and our rights. And just like Michael and Maureen were talking about, how important, it's fascinating how much cooler heads were able to prevail in many of the cases. George Washington. I mean, they're learning about this and they're still telling these militias that are forming up to halt. It's not time to go march on Williamsburg right at this moment. And it's just interesting how different that is compared to up in New England, units coming up and immediately firing into British soldiers. It's just and something very similar to that could have broken out down here in Williamsburg in a very similar manner.
Virginians were more mild-tempered, Mr. Maloy.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Washington, right? The Fairfax militia wants to go in Washington. It plays a pretty big role in saying, like you said, not now. And I think that coolness of Washington is what's going to get him command of the army in Philadelphia, just in June, right? Just a few months after all.
Oh yeah.
He's not a hothead. He's not seen. He's kind of seen as a reluctant rebel per se. That he's not seen as a Sam Adams, Hancock. He's kind of that cool, calm, and collected type personality, which is and being from Virginia is the reason why he gets chosen.
Well, it's amazing he's able to do that. When you read his letters the next month, he's talking about after
Fired up.
how the country is to be either drenched in blood or inhabited by slaves. I mean, Washington was a true believer in the in fighting for their rights, but in this moment of intense tension, he is able to be very cool, and it changes my whole viewpoint of just a few weeks later, he's up in the Second Continental Congress, and everybody knows the story of him wearing his military uniform there. And you can imagine here he is telling these guys to kind of like, calm down. Let's not go charge into the Gunpowder magazine or the governor's palace. And at the same time, yeah, being able to maintain their coolness. It's just I think that's a real important inflection point in the road to revolution in Virginia for sure.
So let's do the opposite of cool. Let's talk about the hothead. Let's talk about Patrick Henry. As Mark mentioned, a lot of the Northern Virginia militia that's congregating and the men in Fredericksburg are thinking about going to Williamsburg. They don't go, they turn around. But there is a few militias that do start going to Williamsburg, and Henry plays a big role in that. Can someone talk about Patrick Henry's kind of role in what happens next in this whole timeline of events? So we've left the governor and the people of Williamsburg have kind of calmed down a little bit, but as Michael said, not everyone has accepted that the powder was taken to protect it. And one of those people was Patrick Henry. So let's chat about Henry and his response to learning about what Dunmore has pulled off. Michael, I'm going to look at you, buddy.
What was that?
I said, I'm going to look at you for that.
All right. So Patrick Henry is going to do exactly what you expect Patrick Henry to do. He's unhappy that the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania and Culpeper militias were able to be turned back because Peyton Randolph told him, please do not come down here. This is only going to make things worse. I mean, when Dunmore thought he was being threatened, he said, I'll arm the slaves and turn the city of Williamsburg to ashes. That's not someone who's willing to compromise because he doesn't have any wiggle room. He doesn't have anybody to protect him. Well, that may not have been the smartest thing they've ever said, but Colonel Patrick Henry and the Hanover militia, they will meet and they will discuss marching down, and then they start moving down on the road later that Washington and Rochambeau will use in order to get to Williamsburg. He starts moving down through New Kent County, and he makes it to Doncaster. We're in James City County, and he'll get right near Toano today at Doncaster Ordinary, right off the Old State Road. And he stops, and Carter Braxton, who'll later sign the Declaration of Independence, rides out from Williamsburg and says, look, don't come into town, because if you do, Governor Dunmore is going to hit the switch and he's going to arm the slaves and burn the city down. And he said, I fought beside Virginians. By God, I'll show them I can fight against them. I mean, this wasn't someone who was, really hitting the diplomat button real well. The Carter Braxton's father-in-law was Richard Corbett, who was the receiver general for Virginia, which in English means he was the king's tax man. So the powder was worth 330 pounds sterling. So Carter Braxton rides back into back into Williamsburg, gets a note for 330 pounds, and gives it to Patrick Henry, and that's the king's money. The king, the king's man, the receiver general, had just paid for the powder. So Patrick Henry feels like he has been vindicated, and they'll return home. And then, of course, he'll go to Scotchtown and Hanover and prepare to go to the Continental Congress, where he's going to use that money to buy more powder in Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's interesting how just paying them off, and that's not really that's not the way I really want to say it, but providing those money for the powder. Later on, some of the militia, some of the Whig leaders or Patriot leaders in Virginia would point to that, saying, this is kind of proof that Dunmore took our powder and we owned it because he paid us for it. And it's interesting that kind of diffused Henry and his militia. I think it was more of a point of pride there at that point, that Henry made his point. And he also had to get to Philadelphia, right? He couldn't miss what was going on up there.
No, he never wanted to miss a party.
So we're going to fast forward a little bit in sake of time. The power's been paid for. The militia doesn't enter the town. The town doesn't get burned. Rockefeller saves it many years later. And Henry goes on to up to Philadelphia. What happens at Dunmore? I mean, and Maureen, you talk about, the family comes back, but at some point, that they're going to leave Williamsburg altogether. So,
Right.
when does that take place, and how does that take place?
So things have calmed down a little bit. Um, Lord Dunmore is writing back and forth to England, which things will come out later. But some of the things that he wrote about in December of 74 start coming out in the newspaper, and it's not very favorable to him. Um, that he's very worried about these people, and, it's just not looking good for him. But really, what triggered it was actually a booby trap at the magazine. So the magazine, Dunmore had people put in a booby trap that if you open the door to check it out, that a lot of this shot would explode. And that's what happened. And two people were severely injured. They weren't killed, but they were injured. So that was June 3rd. So they're mad again. They're very upset. They're not trusting Dunmore. He has a lot of explaining to do about that. And he doesn't feel like they're listening to him again. And this is when he brings back the House of Burgesses. They just came back in session June 1st. And really, Peyton Randolph is trying to be very diplomatic about this. But, the trust issue, I think, is gone. And that's when he decides that he cannot be, by his own actions, I would say he was not safe in Williamsburg anymore. So that's when he leaves and goes on the Fowey, and forever leaves the palace and Williamsburg. And, he won't leave until the following summer, Virginia, but he does leave that and never really works with the Burgesses again.
Does and it's and I totally forget about in June the Burgess is coming back, right? I mean,
June 1st.
literally, yeah, like June 14th, George Washington gets command of the Continental Army, and in Virginia, our House of Burgesses is still going to meet with the governor. Wh when does he send his family away back to Europe? When do they? I mean, are they with him for the next year, or I mean, I'm
No,
assuming that he gets them out of here.
he does. It was, I think, early July of 75 or maybe the end of June. And he sends him back on the HMS Magdalen, which later the Admiralty, the Navy of England is like, you weren't supposed to do that because we need that ship there to
Right.
guard the coast. But he wanted to get information back to England, he said, and also get his family safely away from all these people. And it was an interesting time in Yorktown because I guess there was quite a flotilla out there. And Secretary Nelson was trying to protect the governor in the water. He would come back saying, I will fight you to the end, which he escalated everything he touched, it seemed like. So, and a lot of runaway slaves were going out there, loyalists was going out there. So, I mean, I read there was quite a few ships. I can't remember quite the number, and they also said there was a lot of drinking and other things going on out there. So the people of Yorktown, and also what I read, that the day that they arrived on June 8th, they had a 13-gun salute. So the people of Yorktown, so we're thinking the Nelsons, the Diggs, the Lightfoot families, they thought they were under siege at that point, but they were happy that the governor was there. The governor's people anyway.
Right. Yeah, and again, we won't cover that today. Going into what happens in the fall with Hampton, the burning of Hampton, Kemp's Landing, Great Bridge, et cetera. We'll probably do another version of this talking about these events, but it's still crazy to think about June 14th, Washington takes command of the Continental Army as a Virginian. June 1, the House of Burgesses is still. Now, I
Mhm.
know it's not a very productive meeting, and it doesn't last long, but it's crazy. I think a lot of people who read about this and try to understand these events just think powder's taken in Virginia. Virginia is totally out. They're totally 100% rebelling against the governor and the king and Parliament. And really not that way. I mean, it's a slow burn, but it's a burn, but it's a slow burn. Just the timing of it's all just kind of fascinating to me.
And
Um,
even, well, Peyton Randolph is the president of the Continental Congress.
right,
So he goes up there in May and comes back in time for that June 1st because he's also the president of, he was the leader of the House of Burgesses. So he's there for that meeting too. He was only in Philadelphia a couple weeks.
right.
Yeah,
Um,
all of this just kind of makes me think about that meeting of the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775. I mean, just the atmosphere must have been totally different because when we were up there in September and October 1774, they're talking about how they can conciliate and make peace with Great Britain and have all their grievances addressed. And here they are in May of 1775 now meeting. Massachusetts is at war, and what's going on in Virginia. I mean, just the tensions and everything. It must have felt like they were on the brink of war here as well. It just sets that whole meeting that takes place up there on a whole different level. You can really see how things escalated so quickly to Washington, creation of the Continental Army and the
well,
Washington.
Bunker Hill, one of the bloodiest battles of the war
Bunker
takes place in
Hill.
June. So, I mean, we're really going to be escalating here quick.
Yeah.
Um, well, thank you all. Again, I mean, it's always great to talk with Maureen and Michael. It's always more fun
Thank
walking
you.
around with you guys because you guys just point out all these details. But this is really good too for everyone else who doesn't get a chance to go on your tours. I know you guys do lots of tours. Maureen, do you guys still do tours? I mean, if you do, how can people find out about them?
We do private tours through Hampton Roads Tours at
Okay.
gmail.com. You can email me through that.
And I highly recommend. We've been on some of our gaunts have been with Maureen and Michael through Williamsburg and Yorktown, and I've been visiting there my whole life and always learn something new. So it's always good
Yeah,
to have people
definitely.
on the ground who know the topic very well to spend time with them. And please reach out to her, and we'll put that email address in the chat here too for people to see if they didn't catch it on the video. Uh,
Sounds good.
well, thank you all again. And Mark, thank you. Mark and I will be heading off to Lexington and Concord here in a couple days. When we post this video, we'll be hopefully coming back from there. But, we're trying to keep up with all these events, and hopefully Mark and I can stay married through the 250th. We'll see how that goes. Not to each other,
Yeah.
but to our own wives, but still.
And yeah, there are a lot of events
Absolutely.
going on, and I know some reenactors from the 7th Virginia are going to be recreating part of Patrick Henry's march onto Williamsburg in New Kent County, Virginia, the first weekend of May. So it's really, and I know I believe Colonial Williamsburg is going to be doing something. Well, they would have
Yes.
already by the time this is posted to market as well. But no, it's neat to actually see some of these events be on the place where they actually happened. And yeah, nothing beats that. So.
And it's a good time to visit Williamsburg because they have changed the look of the magazine behind Mark there. I'm not sure if you have the new picture, but they've lowered the wall. They're changing some of the architectural features to the outside of the building based on some research. So if you haven't been down there in the last couple months, do go back down there because they have changed a little bit of the interpretation and the architecture of the Powder magazine. So it's a fantastic building. Well, thank you
Yeah,
all again. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that's also that. I mean, that's the beauty of Colonial Williamsburg. If you haven't been there in general, just because you read about these things, and then yeah, to be able to actually go up to the Powder magazine that was built in 1715, and read about what happened there and actually see it. It just brings it all to life, which is awesome. So.
And it's an original building.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think the four of us do agree history is best learned when you're actually on the spot that took place. So
Absolutely.
always great to do that. Well, thank you all again, and thank you everyone for listening and watching. And we'll be back with you all again in 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, we do a Revelry podcast, and you can find them on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel and our Spotify channel if Mark gets them uploaded in time. So thank you everyone for watching. Take care. Let's see.